Joining us now, Wednesday regular from the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast, and of course, TSN Hockey Insider, it's Mr. Darren Dreger. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Post NHL trade deadline, post NHL general managers meetings, and now we're firmly drifting into those who are going to be willing participants into the final stretches of the regular season and the postseason watch. So a bit of a slower time of year for guys like me, but nice reprieve as well.
Yeah, kick up the heels there. You've worked hard, especially with the Vancouver Canucks. They put you through the ringer this year. So suffer me a Canucks question here, an off-season question. But we heard from Oliver Ekman-Larsson last night at the Canucks telethon. He mentioned that he's hopeful to get back into a game before this season closes. But who knows? There is a lot of talk about how you create cap space next year if you're the Canucks, pressed right up against it after the Philip Hronek trade, and whether a buyout of Oliver Ekman-Larsson, which gets you $8 million in cap space for next year and kicks some pain down the road, is a possibility. What do you think, Drex? Do you think that it would be one of the all-time buyouts, 8 years of carrying the contract? Do you think Canucks ownership would have the appetite for that?
Not at the moment. That's not to say that they can't get there, right? And maybe that's part of the magic of Jimmy Rutherford and Patrick Allvin. If they feel like that's an area that undoubtedly is going to have to be explored. What we know, guys, I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse of that market. Most ownerships loathe the idea of carrying money and buying out contracts because you're paying for players that are no longer with your team, clearly. The Vancouver Canucks, the Aquilini family, they're right near the top of the list of those owners that just do not like doing it and aren't willing to do it at just about any cost. So if the Vancouver Canucks get to that place in the offseason, could Jim Rutherford be persuasive? I guess. But I think that it's up to Patrick Allvin to make some hockey operations decisions, move out some players, get some younger assets as part of the return before that has to be considered. But I can't sit here today and say that it's not going to be considered because, again, when you look at the pieces that the Vancouver Canucks have, the pieces that we think are going to be in play in the offseason, they're not looking to go backwards here. They're not looking at a rebuild, even a renovation. They're looking based on the coaching changes that they made, the time that they made those changes, and some of the other moves that they made, including bringing Hronek in from the Detroit Red Wings to take another step 2-3 in time for training camp and the start of next season. So there could be another hockey trade or two before the notion of buying out contracts is fully embraced by ownership.
In terms of fixing this team, we knew it was going to be a multi-year project. There was a local report this week, Dregs, that Vince Dunn was available to the Canucks for a second-round pick. He's had a marvelous season in Seattle. I know there were some who felt that the shine was coming off his star over the last couple of years. Can you take us through the availability of Dunn as you understood it this past offseason?
Well, this past offseason, I mean, maybe there were mutterings, but I don't think that the Seattle Kraken were considering anything serious. If you want to go back to the days of the St. Louis Blues, then that was more evident, and there was real discussion, conversation around Vince Dunn. And I don't think that Dunn would have minded at that point, because of if you look at the years we're talking about here, the St. Louis Blues were still very much a contending team, and they had depth on that back end, and Vince Dunn was trying to crack a bigger play in the lineup, and he just couldn't get there because of the players ahead of him. I'd be a bit surprised if Seattle was willing to engage, unless the pick was so good that it had to be considered. And again, when we're looking at the Seattle Kraken, I'm sure that even Ron Francis and coaching staff of the Seattle Kraken would look at this year for the most part as being somewhat surprising. Now, Francis did a lot of off-season work. So maybe, again, there were conversations around Vince Dunn, but I honestly, aside from maybe some tire kicking, I didn't hear it. And I think we can appreciate why when you look at everything that Vince Dunn has provided for the Seattle Kraken this year and the type of player that he is.
Dregs, you mentioned the GM's meetings. One of the talking points there was this notion of fighting after clean hits. Yeah. And since then, we've seen that the Quebec Major Junior League is trying to and intends to ban fighting. We're at a point in time, a mix of old school hockey guys and progressives. What's your sense of, just talking to people within the game of where this game is headed?
Well, if we start for the fights after clean hits and the conversations that the managers had last week in Florida, it was more of just, this is something we need to keep an eye on. It's not like Stephen Walken, who's the head of NHL officiating, can simply send out a draft email that says, okay, start calling the instigator every time you believe that there's an unnecessary fight after a legal hit. I mean, that would probably turn things upside down. It wouldn't be fair for the players, and it probably wouldn't be fair for the officials. So they want it on the radar of the managers to take back to their clubs. Now, could we see more instigator penalties called? Absolutely. But it doesn't just have to be the instigator. In fact, it doesn't have to be the instigator at all. I mean, you can call other penalties to coincide, and maybe that then becomes the deterrent by using the existing rule book. All it's going to take is for a fight initiated by a player who gets the extra 2 or more, and the opposing team scores on that power play or additional power plays, and the coach goes, look, I mean, we got to be careful here. We can't avenge every clean hit. But there's also that dynamic, the DNA, if you will, the culture of the National Hockey League. It depends on the player who's the recipient of the clean hit. If it's a star player, if it's Elias Pettersson, yeah, you can bet that there's going to be a reaction from a teammate, probably a teammate immediately on the ice. I think back to the Leafs game last night where Noel Acciari hit Anders Lee. There was no penalty on the play, even though there was blood flowing from the face of Lee. It was Brock Nelson who was hit. And near the end of the game, a game that didn't matter because Toronto was absolutely outclassed in this game, surprisingly, by the Islanders, there was a fight between Matt Martin and Noel Acciari, and the belief was that it was because of that hit earlier in the game. Again, that's part of the culture and the DNA. And just a quick thought, Jeff, on what you asked about with the Quebec Major Junior and where it might go with the CHL. I think it was a bad choice of word. I don't think you can ever fully ban fighting from Major Junior Hockey or the National Hockey League. I just don't think that that's real because of spontaneous combustion. Stuff does happen and there's immediate response to it. So I don't think the Western Hockey League is ever going to change their policing, or at least not at this point. There's an appetite for it. The Ontario Hockey League wants to see the paperwork from the QMJHL and specifically how they're going to crack down additionally on fighting before the OHL decides what they might do.
I want to bring it back to discussions around the trade deadline, because obviously there was a fair bit of smoke in Pittsburgh and the Canucks and JT Miller and everything else. As we sit here, the Pittsburgh Penguins are below the playoff bar in the East. Now, there's still time. They're just a point back of Florida for that final wild card spot. But I don't think Sidney Crosby's season, Darren, is maybe getting the credit and the recognition that it deserves. Or maybe we just take Sid for granted at this stage of his career. But how colossal would it be to that organization to miss the playoffs? And then what do they do moving forward here, committed to that aging core of superstars?
Well, and that's an excellent word, Jeff, is the word committed, because, you are committed to Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and likely Chris Letang as well, although there's always kind of a question mark around Letang and what he may or may not want to do. I remember a couple of years ago, just pontificating, wondering if the Pittsburgh Penguins would ever get to that place with Sidney Crosby where they have a conversation. Sid, do you want to chase another Stanley Cup? Yes, you do? Okay, well, let's make that happen. And it didn't happen. And man, was I vilified in that Pittsburgh market for even having that conversation or suggestion. So it feels like they've probably gone beyond that with Malkin and Crosby right now. And if that's true, then I feel like you have to be indebted to making sure that that team is insulated to a point where they can at least contend for a playoff spot. And that's what they're doing now. And if they get in, then all bets are off. Maybe there's some sort of rejuvenation, if you will, with that group, and, they find a way. But the Eastern Conference is so difficult that it feels like a bit of a stretch. And you guys pay attention to what's going on in all the other markets. Man, Ron Hextall has become a beacon for negativity. Right? The media is after him for not doing enough. So there's going to be a heap of scrutiny on Ron Hextall, on Brian Burke, on management in general of the Pittsburgh Penguins, especially if they don't qualify for the playoffs or if they bow out early. So I think that this could be more about what management didn't do and what the new ownership group of the Pittsburgh Penguins might do if things don't go well with the remaining time here for the Penguins.
Heard the commissioner and the clunky metaphor or analogy he used last week when asked about Pride Nights. We did hear from the Vancouver Canucks on their upcoming Pride Night, Darren, which is March 31st. Yeah. They didn't commit to wearing jerseys, but didn't say they wouldn't either. How big of an issue do you think this is for the National Hockey League and its member clubs, and where do you see this going?
Well, it is a big issue because it's a big issue in society, right? And I don't think that anyone is going to let it drop anytime soon. The National Hockey League, the Players Association, I feel, have done a real good job of making sure that clubs do what they can to respect Pride Nights and some of the other initiatives of diversity, inclusivity, and all of those things. But, where the commissioner's office and the league in general and the Players Association will have to stop short is on the individual player. You can encourage the club to recognize these special occasions like Pride Night, and pretty much everyone does. But there are a handful of individuals who have cited their religious beliefs this season specifically for not participating, wearing the jersey, or recognizing Pride Night. And from an NHL perspective, I mean, what can you do about it? I'm in the camp where I have no problem with the world in general going after the individuals. Most recently, it's James Reimer, for not recognizing the choice and the diversity and the inclusiveness and all of those things, right? But then I think about that and I'm like, okay, well, what about everybody else that does the great things that matter to continue to support things like Pride Night? Let's not let one individual, close-minded or whatever, using their religious belief to support their decision, ruin what is otherwise a very, very good night and supported by everyone else. So I think that's more the position now of the National Hockey League in doing what they can do to support things like Pride Night and worrying less about the handful of individuals who choose not to.
So you don't see suspensions on the horizon here?
That'd be a difficult one, man, because it then becomes a slippery slope, doesn't it, for all the other aspects? But I haven't been in a scrum, and I was in one recently with the commissioner and Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly as part of the GM's meetings. This was pre-James Reimer, so it wasn't brought up specific to that. But I don't see how the NHL and the Players Association could go down that path.
Dregs, the sport of baseball, basking in the afterglow of a tremendous finish, obviously, and a successful World Baseball Classic. And, of course, in this country and in this sport, we now look at hockey and think when are we going to get best on best? The appetite seems to be there. This notion, again, I mentioned Sidney Crosby earlier, that Crosby and daylight's fading on his career, and he and McDavid haven't had the chance to throw on Canadian jerseys together. Do you think another sports successful tournament can spur on hockey to make this happen?
I think it can, because it, again, puts a spotlight on what an international best on best like that. And you can argue, was it really best on best? But last night, when you see Ohtani and Mike Trout in a showdown, man, that's tough to beat. And the theater that was generated from that exercise, I'm sure that the head office of the National Hockey League is looking at that and going, man, that would be nice. I mean, I think that the players, to a man, Connor McDavid, Sidney Crosby, the stars of the stars of the stars of the National Hockey League want that. But there's got to be more pressure here. And, I know a good friend, Alan Walsh of the show, was tweeting about, the NHL needs to do it. Gary Bettman has to find a way to, well, yes, I endorse the pressure on that, but that pressure also has to come from the Players Association. Just find a way to make it happen. It's been dragged out to a point here where you're starting to wonder if it's going to happen. It was delayed once. There's some battling with international federations over what's the best time to do it. Is it September? Is it February? How can they make that work? I mean, there are a lot of hurdles on this road. But I think in light of what we saw and how great it was with baseball, that maybe we do need to get a little bit more heat from Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid and the stars of the National Hockey League. Put more pressure on the National Hockey League and all the parties involved to finally push this thing through. Because, man, it's been months. It hasn't been weeks of the ongoing back and forth and still no firm decision yet.
Yeah, and the sad part is no best on best. We haven't had it since 2014, and we may not have it in 2026, even if the league does get back to the Olympics because of the Russia question. And who knows when that federation will be back and allowed into the international sporting community. Could happen. Could happen. We'll see. Lots of time. Dregs, marvelous stuff. Thank you for this. Have a great week. We'll catch up next Wednesday.
All right, guys. Thank you.